Hello and welcome to another Maine SBDC webinar. My name is Kelsey Reardon and I am with the state office hosted by the University of Southern Maine right in Portland. And today we have fellow Maine SBDC at USM Center Director and Business Advisor Peter Harriman, who's going to be talking about hiring independent contractors for your small business. So hiring employees versus independent contractors is different, and we are trying to keep everybody up to date with all of the requirements. So we are offering that in a couple different places. We also have an e-course all about hiring your first Maine employee. So we're trying to cover all of the different options for hiring, but today we're going to be primarily focused on independent contractors. I'll be sending out a follow-up email after today's presentation that will include the slides as well as a link to the recording and all of our contact information. So it'll be easy for you to access all of that. If you have any questions along the way, you can stick them in the chat and we'll make sure we answer them. If we don't answer them along the way, they'll get answered at the end. Peter just typed in there, so it should pop up for everybody. If you're not familiar with Maine SBDC, we are the Small Business Development Centers, and we provide no-cost confidential business advising. So we can help you with your small business questions, and if we can't answer your question, we can certainly find someone who can. So Peter will explain a little bit more about that. But if you're not already set up with a business advisor, there's an orange button on our website that says Request Advising, and that is the fastest way to get into our system. And then you'd be connected with an advisor either geographically very close to you, or if you have a specific industry or issue, we could connect you with someone who has experience with that. Otherwise, I think we're all ready to get started today. So I'll pass it over to Peter.
Thanks, Kelsey. So hiring an independent contractor for your small business. Hopefully you're in the right place, but Maine beats the national average for who is considered a self-employed or contractor, right? The national average is 10% or 6% rather. Maine is on average 10%. And you can see a little map in the right-hand side, and that shows you kind of the darker blue is where the higher self-employed people are considered. So Maine has a lot of contractors. So the purpose of the presentation is to help you understand some of the questions that you should explore when you're hiring a contractor and some of the common forms that you're going to encounter when you hire a contractor. As Kelsey said, there's going to be a copy of these slides. I think she just sends them anyway. The webinar is being recorded, so those who came here live get the chance to ask their questions and get them answered right away. Otherwise, you'll be watching this on YouTube. Right? Again, questions in the chat, please, and then we can get to them throughout the presentation. If it is a question that is very specific to your business and it gets into the nitty-gritties and gets into the weeds, no problem at all. That's why I put my email address as my name in the window there. So please email me if it's a very specific question. If it's a general question, great. Feel free to put that in chat. I'm going to get to this in a second, but we do put everything on YouTube now. So if you're watching this later, then you didn't get a chance to answer a question or ask a question in person. You got to come in person. So the agenda, we're going to just talk about who we are, briefly, who the SBDC is, the Small Business Development Center. Then we're going to get right into the pros and cons of hiring a contractor. Then we're going to get into the Maine Department of Labor test on what is a contractor versus an employee. Then we're going to talk about how the IRS sees it, because they see it a little differently, and we want to make sure we understand both sides of the coin there. Then we're going to talk about the paper trail you want to create when you decide that it is indeed a contractor that you're hiring and not an employee. And finally, we'll have some resources that are available to you. My name is Peter Harriman. I've been a certified business advisor since 2015. Can you believe it? Almost 8 years already. Woo! I cover Cumberland and York counties. Again, my email address is there, though it is also on my video picture on the top right, usually for your screen. I work out of the USM building in Portland. What we do as the Small Business Development Center, we are a no-cost business advising. A lot of people say no cost. I like to say prepaid, because you're a taxpayer. You already paid for us, so use us, right? So basically we help with business planning, business startups, or if you're an existing business and you have questions like, hey, is this a contractor or an employee? That's what we do. That's our bread and butter. We try to help businesses because guess what? When you start a business, there is no instruction manual that is sent to you. You have to find the answers on your own. So we try to help you either give you answers or find the answers for you, right? And try to overall make you a better business person. Now, business is always changing, so we pride ourselves in trying to stay on top of the most pressing topics that come up. And during the recent pandemic, we had economic injury disaster loans, PPP, Maine economic grants, CDBG grants, shutter venue grants, rural restaurant revitalization fund, the LMNOP that always comes out from government, right? They come up with these nice acronyms, come up with these plans. I think there's a Thrive program going on right now from FAME. So we try to stay on top of the most pressing and most recent issues for a business and try to advise on that as well. So as Kelsey said, if you sign up for advising, you'll be asked, do you want to meet in person or do you want to meet through virtual Zoom? Zoom has been great, but some people do like to meet. If you're someone who wants to meet in person, we do have 21 locations throughout the state of Maine. Most of the time, that location is within driving distance of where you are located. We are a small agency, but we have big accomplishments, right? We see more than 2,000 people for the last year, created or saved a bunch of jobs, had people access capital, helped people start businesses, and we do many, many, many webinars to help get the information out there that is important to businesses, right? I'm very, very proud of that, and Kelsey helps us make that happen. Now, as Kelsey said, the easiest way to sign up for advising if you need it is to go to our website, and in the top right corner is that request advising button. Just click that, we'll get in touch with you, usually pretty fast. Or if you're someone who'd rather, at 2 o'clock in the morning, sit down and watch a video, check us out on YouTube. That's where we post all of our webinars or learning materials, and you can subscribe to our channel and get updated whenever you have a new video hitting the YouTube channel, right? So a big disclaimer. I provide a lot of advice. In 8 years, I've seen a lot of different things, and I can tell you a lot about a lot. But I do not provide tax, legal, or accounting advice, right? So during my advising with other people, especially during this webinar where there's some legal implications, there might be times where I say, hey, this is what you need. You need a contract that covers this. You want to talk to a lawyer to make sure it's legal, right? Or you want to talk to an accountant to make sure that you understand the taxes involved or the penalties involved. So that's our big disclaimer. Now, on with the show. Why hire a contractor? Why do it at all, right? And the common reasons I hear from employers as far as why do I want to hire a contractor are, my business is doing well. I like to expand, but I'm not ready for that full-time employee yet, right? Or I only have a really short period of high intensity work. So, I just need to get through the busy season, and then it kind of slows down because we're in Maine. There's a lot of tourist type businesses out there, right? Or along with the tourist type businesses, maybe you're only open a portion of the year, so you don't need someone to be there all year round, like an employee. Or quite simply, you don't want to deal with payroll or employees because employees do bring their own issues, right? So another reason is I want to test drive the potential employee and see how they work before I hire them, right? That's another common thing that I've been hearing lately, right? So there's lots of good reasons to hire a contractor, right? This webinar is going to try to help you do it right and understand that there is a big difference between a contractor and an employee. And the big reason that we're doing this webinar is that in Maine, the default presumption is that anyone you hire is an employee, right? Not a contractor. So the default presumption is that they're employees. So it's on you, the employer, to prove that the person you're hiring is a contractor, right? So what is the difference between a contractor and an employee, right? Well, And we'll get into this a little more, but very basically, you have one employee and one contractor. Employees are trained. You train them on the system, you train them how to do the job. Contractor already knows the job. Employee has a set schedule. Contractors set their own schedule. An employee has an ongoing relationship with you as far as you agree to hire them for 40 hours a week. A contractor, you have a set contract term, right? An employee is going to be covered by workers' comp, unemployment, and you're going to pay half of their FICA, the Social Security and Medicare. The employer is going to pay that, right? The contractor, they pay their own taxes. So there are quite a few differences. And the biggest thing is, what are the benefits of hiring that contractor? Well, as I said, with a contractor, when you hire them, you're hiring them for a specific contract. So you're hiring them for a job. So there's some staff flexibility that built in when you're hiring a contractor, because once the job is done, the contract is over, right? So you can ramp up as the work is needed, or as the work piles on. You can ramp down as the work goes away. So there's staff flexibility there. There's no payroll to worry about. You don't have to worry about FICA, unemployment, or workers' comp for that contractor, right? It's pretty straightforward tax paperwork. It's a 1099 at the end of the year. In some instances, you can reduce your exposure to lawsuits. And I put a little star there because hiring a contractor doesn't necessarily alleviate you from all exposure to lawsuits, right? And this is, again, where you'd want to talk to a lawyer about what is your responsibility with hiring a contractor as far as exposure to lawsuits, right? With a contractor, you're hiring someone a little more experienced than you might hire if you hire an employee, right? So you're getting those contractors' skills and expertise without having them as an employee. So you can hire them just to do that specific job that you need that highly skilled expertise at. And then once it's over, it's done. You don't have to keep them on at that higher wage. So for a lot of businesses, I hear that contractors just seem easier than employees, right? They're just easier to deal with. Now, the drawbacks to hiring a contractor, because we want to make sure that we give you the full picture here, right? The drawbacks, they're not part of your staff. So there is a lack of company loyalty, right? Work piles on, you're expecting this contractor to help you out maybe with the work. They might say, nope, sorry, I got a better offer somewhere else. So they're not beholden to you. They are their own business. They promote their own brand, not necessarily yours. So I see this in the trades a lot. You are a general contractor, you hire an electrician, they're not going to drive up with your brand on their truck. They're going to drive up with their brand on their truck, which is fine. You just need to understand that a contractor has their own brand. They don't and probably shouldn't be promoting your brand as far as decals on a truck, right? You do lose some control over the work being done. Remember that example of, work piles up and the contractor decides to leave? Well, contractors can refuse to continue the contract, right? They could cancel a contract, but the contracts, as I said, are set per job or they're set per a time period. And so the contractor could say, I'm not going to resign. I know you got a lot of work, and maybe you planned as a business to ramp up using contractors, but you got to remember, contractors at any time can refuse to re-sign the contract or refuse the work that they're not already contracted with. So additional work. Also, unless there is an agreement that any intellectual property or efficiencies that the contractor ends up developing on the job is the property of you, the employer, that belongs to the contractor. So an example of that is I had a contractor or an employer who hired a contractor who developed a very efficient app for scheduling clients or for doing a job with clients. And when that contract was over, that contractor took that app because that was their app. It wasn't there was nothing in the contract about developing an app. It was only they were going to do XYZ job. So remember, when an employee creates an app on your dime when you're paying them, it's your property. It's your intellectual property, you, the employer. If a contractor develops something and it wasn't in the contract, they just developed it to make their job easier to fulfill the contract, That's their intellectual property. They can take that. Your right to fire a contractor is dependent on the contract, right? So within the contract, there should be stipulations. And again, you'd work with a lawyer to establish a contract. But in the contract, there should be a stipulation on how do I hire, how do I hire a contractor, but also how do I, what notice do I need to give, or how do I terminate this agreement? And then on the reverse side, if they want to terminate the agreement with me, what kind of notice would they want to give to me, right? So it works both ways. Also, if a contractor's hurt on the job, they might be able to sue you, right? And this is a relatively recent development, right? And if you follow the news at all in the trades, there was a roofer who fell off and hurt themselves, and they sued. They were a contractor. They sued the general contractor, and it was deemed that the general contractor should have ensured a safe workplace. And we mentioned safe workplace before. So there is the possibility, if you do not provide a safe workplace, that you could get sued for that, even though you're hiring contractors. So again, that's where you want to check with a lawyer to say, what is my liability concerning contractors and if they can sue me. The other thing is you could come under more scrutiny from the federal or state regulators when you hire contractors, because remember, the default in Maine is that you're hiring employees. You have to prove to the federal or state regulators that this person meets the measure of what a contractor is, right? So in order to not be considered an employee, the Maine Department of Labor has a 7-step guide, and there's the website right there, but they have a 7-step guide to work through. And we're going to go through each one of these steps, okay, one by one, just so we're very clear, because it's not intuitively clear. So step 1, is the individual free from direction or control of the employing unit? And you're going to find this a lot with the different, what is a contractor versus employee, is it's all about the control. If you as the employer have a lot of control as far as when they show up to work, how they do the work, when they do the work, how long they stay on the work site, if you have a lot of control over it, then that might be an employee, right? Contractors, I can't stress this enough, contractors make their own schedule. If a contractor wants to come in at 8 but decides to come in at 9, that's up to them, right? You can't call them up and say, hey, you need to be here at 8, unless there's some reason for it, like, hey, electrician has to be here before the plumber is here, or whatever. But otherwise, the contractor makes their own schedule. If you're saying you need to be here at 8 and you got to stay till 5, that might be an employee. That's too much control to have to call it a contractor. If you feel like they have their own control, you go to step 2. Does the individual have essential right to control the means and progress of the work except to the final results? So, for instance, you could say, hey, over the course of a week, I would suggest, the employer would suggest to the contractor that you do A, B, C, and D, and you do it over the course of a week. Well, you can suggest it, but the contractor could decide, I can do A, B, C the day before and have D perfectly fine, perfectly good final result, because I have the right to control the means and progress of how I do this work, right? We see this a lot. So basically, contractors can decide what method would be best to achieve the outcome, as long as those final results are what was agreed upon, right? So again, it comes down to control. Are you controlling how they're doing it, or are you giving them kind of free rein on how to do it, and as long as they have that outcome? So if it's yes, if they have their own ability to do how they want to do it, as long as the outcome is what I want, then they go to step 3, right? Step 3, is the individual customarily engaged in an independently established trade, occupation, profession, or business, right? So this really comes down to how is this contractor approaching this job, right? Are they approaching it like an employee who doesn't keep track of expenses, doesn't do any advertising, doesn't think about continuing education or anything like that? Or is this someone who's treating it like they have their own business, right? Is it someone who has created letterhead for invoices Is it someone who advertises or who can work for someone else? And we'll get to that in a second. But is it someone who this is what they do? They engage. It isn't saying that maybe this contractor, you're the only one working for them, or you're the only employer. It's just saying, do they treat it like a business, or are they treating it like an employee would, right? If they're treating it like a business, we go to step 4. Does the individual have the opportunity for profit and loss as a result of the services being performed for the other individual or entity? This is a really big one, okay? Really big. If you hire someone and there's no opportunity for them to actually lose money, and this sounds really weird, and I'll give an example in a second, but if there's no opportunity, no chance that they're going to lose money, you're guaranteed they're going to be paid 40 hours a week, no matter what the outcome is as far as the job or the product, that might not be a contractor. That's more like an employee, because an employee, if an employee cleans the bathroom and I don't think they did a good job, I'm going to tell them to go back and re-clean that bathroom, but they're still on the clock. They're still getting paid. They're not losing money. If a contractor cleans a bathroom and they didn't do a good job, I'm going to tell them, you didn't meet the contract, go back and clean it. I'm not going to pay them anymore, right? So essentially, they're losing that time value of money having to go back and re-clean it. Or maybe they create a product and it isn't up to the specifications. They're going to correct that, and that's going to be a loss to them, right? So a contractor, they have to be held liable to, or they should be held liable to what the contract says as far as the specifications of how the job should be performed. And if it isn't performed right, there should be that opportunity where they have to lose either money or time correcting that, right? And they have to have or be able to show that there is that potential for loss. If there is that potential for loss, we go to step 5, right? Does the individual hire and pay his or her assistants, if any, to the extent that these assistants are employees, and that they, the contractor, would supervise the details of their work? So this one's pretty straightforward, right? So basically, if you hire a contractor and they have too much work, they're not going to ask you to hire another contractor. They might, but you're not going to hire another contractor. They're going to hire an assistant to help them, and that assistant is going to say boss and look at the contractor. They're not going to say boss and look at you. Their boss is the contractor, right? And that's basically what step 5 is saying, is that if this contractor decides to hire someone or to pay them, it's out of their pay. They're the boss. It's their business, right? So if that is true, we go to step 6. Right? Remember, there's only 7 steps here, so I'm almost done on this. So step 6, does the individual make their services available to some client or customer or community, even if their right to do so is voluntarily not exercised or is temporarily restricted? So basically, we established before they're treating it like a business. Do they advertise or do the business for anyone else? Right? Now remember, it's not so much that they are doing it. It's could they do it, right? Do they have the right to do it? Is there nothing stopping them from being able to do the same services for a competitor, right? Because they don't have to exercise that right. Maybe they're happy with you and they're going to stay with you because they like the relationship, they like how you're paying them, right? So remember, even if their right to do so is voluntarily not exercised or is temporarily restricted. So doesn't mean they have to, but could they have the ability to make their services available to some other client or community or customer, right? If yes, you go to the final step 7. I'll apologize right now because it's a big list and you got to choose 3. They got to meet at least 3 of the following elements, right? Either the individual has a substantive investment in the facilities, tools, instruments, materials, and knowledge used by the individual to complete the work. So long story short of this one is, if I hire a contractor to build a deck for me, I am not going to provide the lumber or the screws or the nails or the nail gun or anything like that. They're going to provide their own tools when they show up to build my deck and their own materials. Or if we're in a more professional setting where there aren't maybe tools, maybe it's a physical therapist, right? They're going to provide their own license. They're going to provide or pay for their own CEUs, continuing education credits, or they're going to provide their own worker liability insurance, right? So they're going to provide, or they're going to have a substantial investment in themselves versus if I'm an employee in that setting, the employer is going to provide the tools or the materials or the money for the CEUs or anything like that. Next one, the individual is not required to work exclusively for the other individual. So basically what we had just said, are they able to work for a competitor, or are they able to hire or market their services to other people, right? The individual is responsible for satisfactory completion of the work and may be held contractually. Contractually, that's a big word there, is there should be a contract, and we'll get to that. Responsible for failure to complete the work. So just like we had just said on one of the previous ones, so this is a little bit of a repeat, but we're really trying to make sure we're classifying them correctly. So if they fail to do task A or complete widget B up to the contract standards, are they responsible for that failure to not complete, that they didn't complete the work, that they either have to complete it or there's some kind of stipulation in the contract, right? The parties have a contract that defines the relationship and gives contractual rights in the event the contract is terminated by the other individual entity prior to completion of the work. So again, working with a lawyer, you really want to make sure the contract includes how do you terminate from the employer to the contractor? How does the employer how does the employer terminate the contract relationship? How does the contractor terminate the employer relationship, right? It goes both ways. But is that in the contract? Payment to the individual is based on factors directly related to the work performed and not solely on the amount of time expended. And I get a lot of eyebrows that raise on this one because a lot of contractors do bill by the hour, right? They send you an invoice for the hourly. But overall, your contract is to complete a certain task or to complete a certain product, right? There's some kind of end completion. There might have billable hours up into that, but it's not like an employee that you pay them 40 hours a week, regardless if the work is actually done, right? So it's a little different. Such work is outside the usual course of business for which the services is performed. So this means if I'm a painting company and I hire a contractor to do my bookkeeping, well, painting and bookkeeping are different services, right? So obviously the bookkeeper is not a secret employee of the painting business because it's not the same services that I'm performing. So that's very clear cut. That's usually an easy one for a lot of people. And the final one, the individual has an IRS determination called an SS8 of independent contractor status. And we'll get to that in a second as well. So with step 7, you have to make sure you can check at least 3 of these elements. And again, this is the final step for the Maine Department of Labor, right? At least 3 of these. But it's important to know the Department of Labor is different than the IRS. And the IRS has a similar but slightly different rules as the Department of Labor. This is what really aggravates people, is the state has one standard, the IRS has a slightly different standard. And with the IRS, they go all by what they deem is reasonable, right? And you could say reasonableness is very subjective, right? So the IRS keeps it a little more loosey-goosey, right? The Department of Labor with Maine, you could see, you could kind of go through each question and decide yes or no before moving on to the next question. With the IRS, it's more broad, and it's could you pass the straight face test of explaining how this person is a contractor versus an employee, right? There have been times where, according to the state, it is a contractor, but when we get to the IRS, they say, no, it isn't. So again, this webinar is going to try to make sure we're all on the same page as to how people are viewing this, is the state, the feds, and you, the employee. Right. So the general rule for the IRS is that an individual is an independent contractor if the payer has the right to control or direct only the result of the work, not what will be done and how it will be done. Right. So diving into this a little bit further, the IRS really has 3 factors that they're going to use to determine, is this a contractor or is this an employee, right? The first factor behavioral, right? Does the employer have the right to control the work performed? What is the behavior that we see between the contractor and the employer? Is the employer treating the contractor like an employee? Are they demanding they come in at a certain time and stay till a certain time? Are they giving them the tools to do it? Are they having them punch a time clock, right? Because then that gets into the second one, the financial, the second factor, the financial factor. Who does supply the tools? How are they paid? Can they work for other people, right? If you say, oh, they punch a time clock and they better not work for the competitor, well, that's control you have over them to not be able to work for a competitor, and that you're going to have them punch a time clock, and that's too much control. You're looking at an employee. Again, the schedule is a big one that I see. Contractors have their own schedules. The last factor that the IRS looks at is relational, especially if there's a written contract or benefits with hiring the contractor, right? I can't stress enough. It's right in the name. If you're hiring a contractor, you want a written contract, right? Now, the IRS does allow employers to file what's called an SS8, right? So it's something the employer files, SS8. They file it to the IRS. It's called a determination of status. And the IRS will ask questions, the employer will answer, and the IRS will send back a letter saying, this is a contract relationship or this is not. This is an employee relationship, right? Now, I've done my research with the IRS, and currently, as of a few months ago, the SS8 was taking about 6 months to happen. So there's another alternative that I have from a state level that you could try as well that's a little faster than that. But the SS8 is something that you have in your toolbox as an employer to try to do this. Now, typically, I do hear the SS8 is useful for if you get audited, you can add an SS8 to your file. You can ask the IRS to look at the relationship and file one for you. But as I said, SS8s do take a little bit of time. So typically, if you're going to hire a contractor, I don't see many SS8 forms being done before you hire them. Right. Now, why is this such a hot button topic as far as contractor versus employee? I mean, everyone's getting paid anyway, so what's going on? Well, it's becoming a hot button topic for political and for economic reasons, right? Wage theft, which is when you're underpaying workers, and this is where you're paying a contractor, or you're paying who should be an employee as a contractor, so you're not paying them the Social Security and Medicare, and you're not paying the unemployment, and you're not paying the workers' comp. That adds up to about $30 million every year that the Maine Center for Economic Policy figures is what we call wage theft. Misclassification is thought to impact 10 to 30% of all private sector employees. There's a lot of unsafe working conditions that rather than address the issues, they just hire contractors and try to bypass the issues. Or there's just discrimination and sexual harassment in the workplace that in a contractor relationship goes under the radar, versus if they were an employee would have more options to be able to bring this to the federal or state eyes, so to say, to be able to report discrimination or sexual harassment, versus if you're a contractor and how you can report those. So it's become a pretty big issue. So what happens with misclassification if you hire someone as a contractor and they're misclassified, right? Well, some common examples of what could go wrong or how these things come to light oftentimes is a contractor will get hurt on the job and they'll file workers' comp, right? And they'll say, well, my employer, and there's this jarring where the contractor believes themselves to be an employee. And that's a common theme that you're going to see here. Or the contractor work ends and the contractor files for unemployment. Or the contractors feel that they earned overtime wages because they're asked to work longer, let's say, by the employer, and they file a complaint because they weren't paid overtime. Or the contractor feels that you discriminated and or didn't recognize their rights, right? And with all of these, as I said, there's this realization that the contractor believes themselves to be an employee or believes themselves to have the rights of an employee and not a contractor. They don't fully realize that they are a contractor. And when that happens, it prompts them to go to the Department of Labor or the National Wages and Labor Division or the IRS, all three of which have what we call Memorandum of Understandings, MOUs, which is where they share information back and forth. So any of these things happen, then one of these three are going to know about it and they're going to share the information with the others, right? So what are the financial penalties for misclassification? Well, if it's deemed to be an unintentional, so you're just like, oh, I thought they were a contractor, but after I look at all the tests, all the questions that the Department of Labor came up with or the IRS has, I do realize that they are an employee now. So they're going to charge you some financial penalties and there might be some state penalties. These penalties are the federal penalties, right? If they believe it was an intentional misclassification, again, sometimes one bad seed ruins a bunch. So if there's an intentional misclassification, that's considered fraud. You can have fines, you can have jail time, and that's both federal and state laws cover that. And you end up owing a lot of money in back pay, 100% of the employee and employer FICA taxes and 20% of wages. They're for either unintentional or intentional misclassifications, either one, I have seen it put businesses out of business because of what they did. So that's the strong point about this webinar is, hey, let's really make sure, let's go through how the Department of Labor classifies them. Let's go through how the IRS classifies them and make sure that we're not classifying them incorrectly, right? So we went through how to classify them. We went through what happens and why it's important to classify them and some of the financial stuff. So you decided, yes, they meet everything that you just talked about. They are a contractor, right? Now, what do I do? How do I go about hiring the contractor, right? So there's some paperwork that you're going to want to do for hiring a contractor. And this is paperwork that you usually want to have in place before the contractor starts, right? Obviously, before they start, you want to have a contract with them. And there's a lot of different elements to that contract. There's, the scope of work, there's either the timeline or the job that gets done. There's how do you terminate the on either end? How do you terminate the relationship? How do you get paid? How do you submit invoices? There's a lot of different elements in the contract that you'd want a lawyer to review to make sure they meet Maine law. But long story short is, if you hire a contractor, you need a contract, right? They need to be working under a contract. They need to fill out a W-9 form, or they should fill out a W-9 form. Now, a W-9 form is an internal form. It's nothing you're going to send to the IRS, but they do have that available for download. The W-9 form is collecting the information that you need to be able to send out a 1099 if that contractor meets the $600 or more in a year threshold where a 1099 is needed. Now, the big hint I have with W-9s is on the form that you have them fill out, the contractor can either use their EIN, their employer identification number, or their social security number. For me, any contractor who uses their social security number is kind of a red flag saying, hey, there might be confusion here from that contractor on whether they're an employee filling in a W-4 or they're a contractor filling out a W-9. So my helpful hint here is always have whoever you're hiring as a contractor, even if they're a sole proprietor, always have them use an EIN when you're doing the W-9. Now, if it's a sole proprietor, first time contracting, doesn't have an EIN, no worries. The IRS will assign an EIN for free. The IRS will never get between you and paying taxes. So they have a website. It's very fast, usually done within a matter of minutes, and it comes to you in an email. So getting an EIN is not a very hard thing to do, and it's a free. So on the W-9, I usually advise use the EIN. Copies of the business insurance carried by the contractor. Remember, you're treating this contractor like they are their own business. So not every business needs insurance, but if you're in a trade where business is, or insurance rather, is customary for that business, especially professional liability insurance. But if it's just general liability insurance and it's customary for someone in that business to have it, then you're going to want to get a copy of their business insurance and keep that on file, that they have a policy, right? Maine Workers' Comp Board, and I have a link at the end of this webinar. The Maine Workers' Comp Board has a form called the WBC 266. It's called a predetermination letter. So remember we talked about the IRS had an SS8 form to help determine if it's a contractor or an employee. Well, this Maine Workers' Comp Board form, this is one that the contractor fills out, not the employer. So the SS8, the employer fills out. The WBC 266, the predetermination letter, this is something that you tell the contractor, hey, you need to send in this predetermination letter to the Maine Workers' Comp Board, and they are going to send a letter back that's good for 1 year that says, yes, based on the answers to your question and the relationship between you and the employer, you are considered a contractor with this employer. Now, you do have to do it for each employer. So if you're a contractor watching this webinar, you want to do one of these predetermination letters per employer. You can't just do one and have it cover you for everyone. But for an employer, I would have this in the file before that contractor started, because then that's something from the state that was done by the contractor, filled out by the contractor, where the contractor explained their relationship with you that says, hey, we determined that this person is a contractor and not an employee. Copies of any current licenses, registrations, or permits, right? This all depends on what is customary in your field. Understanding how the contractor will invoice for services, right? This will be in the contract, but this is also something you want to make sure you have a separate check for on any kind of checklist. And I do have a checklist in a second, but how is the contractor going to invoice for their services? And I would strongly suggest to any employer who's hiring a contractor that the contractor actually submits an invoice to you. You know, it could be weekly, it could be bi-weekly, it could be however you agree to it, you know, pending a lawyer reviewing it. But you want to have an invoice because the contractor is not an employee. The contractor is not punching a time clock. The contractor is invoicing. They're a business that you hire to do a certain service or create a certain product. So they want them to have an invoice that they give you, right? Now, there's some less common paperwork that I did want to mention, right? Sometimes you're working with proprietary information or you're working with customer accounts. So there might be confidentiality agreements or NDA, non-disclosure agreements that you might need a contractor to sign. You might need the contractor to provide proof of their qualifications or their resume with their qualifications on it. There might even be security clearances or drug tests that you need, you know, depending on the industry that you're going to want the contractor to have passed. If you're working in the medical field, then any contractor who is going to be dealing with HIPAA protected information, it should sign a BAA agreement form, and you can usually download one online. Or, as I said, you could do the IRS form, the SS8 form, as an employer, but that can take up to 6 months before you actually get it back. So I always advise to people, make a contractor checklist, create a file folder, right? Just like this. This is just an example, right? Each year, do this. And yes, I get people that say, well, I want to hire this person indefinitely, right? We work together very well. He's my buddy. I'm just going to write an open-ended contract. Don't do open-ended contracts. A contract should have a set beginning and a set result or end date, right? So with a contract, with this checklist, you should do it. I always say do it every year, right? Nothing says they can't re-sign the contract 1 year after another. So make the contract for a year. You're going to want to get a new predetermination letter anyway, because those are only good for a year. You're going to have to update their W-9 information in case anything's changed as far as their address or their name, for that matter. And you want to update their business insurance if they gave that to you as well. So every year have this checklist and make sure that you're updating the contractor file so that things go a little more smoothly for you, so that when it comes time for an audit, you have already established two things. One, that contractor who has been doing this checklist every year with you, it's less likely that contractor believes that they're an employee because they're signing contracts, they're doing W-9s, they're submitting this stuff, the predetermination letter and all that jazz, right? So it's less likely they're going to be confused as to if they're an employee or a contractor. And two, if you have these things, right, but any potential audit that might come your way, if you have all this stuff, it's going to be a lot easier. I can't guarantee that you'll pass the audit, but if you have this stuff, it becomes a lot easier to go through that audit than if you didn't have these things, right? So a contract, W-9, updated insurance, the predetermination letter, any licenses, registrations, permits, any kind of industry specific forms, and agreement on how invoices would be submitted. Now, to summarize, because I know I've been talking a lot, I know it hasn't been very colorful slides for this particular webinar, but first, you're going to determine if you need to hire additional help, right? If your business is at the point of where it's expanding, right? And then for that help you're going to hire, you have to understand what roles and responsibilities you're going to need them to perform. Because once you understand that, then you go to step 2 of, would this help be classified as an employee or a contractor? And again, it comes down to, if there's one thing that is most looked at, it's that control over the work being done, controlled over the hours being worked. That is one of the key linchpins to employee versus contractor. Once you decide that, then you collect the proper documentation. If they're a contractor, we just went through that. If they're an employee, we have other webinars available that goes through how to hire a Maine employee. Keep the records. You keep them for 10 years. And when in doubt, get help, right? This is not something you want to kind of guess at. This is something that you want to get right, because we went through some of the penalties for misclassification, right? We don't want you to misclassify someone. If they're an employee, they're an employee. That's all right. And there's steps to take with an employee, right? And there's pros and cons to hiring an employee, and there's pros and cons to hiring a contractor. But we want to make sure that we understand what we're doing. So we want to reach out, we want to get help, we want to talk to lawyers, talk to the SBDC, talk to accountants, but don't just wing it, right? So thank you for coming. I know I just talked for a good 48 minutes here. As promised, here are the resources or other resources available. There's the Maine Department of Labor, there's a resource from the IRS, and the bottom one there is that link to get the predetermination letter from the Workers' Comp Board. As I said, any contractor that I hired, if I'm an employer, any contractor should have that on file before they start. And it's pretty quick turnaround too. It's not like the IRS SSA. So with that being said, do we have any questions?
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, Peter. We haven't got any questions yet, but if anybody has them, they can stick them in the chat. Likewise, like I said, I'll be sending out a follow-up email later on, and you can respond to any email you've gotten from me with a question in the future. But Peter's contact information will also be in there, and easy link to request advising. But yeah. Chris says this was very thorough, and we'll pass it on to her client. So we're lucky to have fellow business advisor Chris Cole join us today. It's always nice to see advisors working together to make sure our clients have all the information. Thanks for joining, Chris.
Yes, I often, if that's why we put it on YouTube. Not everyone can get here at 12 to 1 on a Thursday. So we record it, we put it on YouTube. So I find a lot of people actually end up either signing up and planning to watch the YouTube or watch the YouTube right from the get-go. But many clients that I've just sent the YouTube video link to get the information. The contractor employee, misclassification issue is going to come up more often. I can't stress that enough. It is a hot button political issue, especially if states are looking for more funding options or more workers' rights. This is going to be how one of the ways that they solve that, right? Because employees, for them, more money versus contractors. And protecting the rights of workers has become a very big political issue. So you got two birds with one stone from the government's perspective, economic and political. So I imagine you'll see more of this. So thank you for coming. Thank you for attending. I hope that now the subject is a little more clear to you as far as some of the tests that you might be subject to from the Maine Department of Labor and the IRS on how they view contractors and employees, and then some of the documentation that you can put together to make sure if you're ever asked by one of these governmental entities that you have the proper documentation, and so that you can sleep better at night knowing that, hey, I do understand the relationship. There is no real question here about which classification they fall under.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, Peter. Keep an eye out for my follow-up emails. Oh, Peter, yeah. See, someone had to join late. They're very thankful that there's a recording. I don't keep an eye out for my follow-up email, and you can jump off as soon as you jumped on. So we're always thrilled to hear that people are utilizing the different avenues for accessing our e-courses. We want to make sure it's as accessible as possible. So thanks for the reinforcement.
And you will get copies of the people that attended will get copies of the slides. So you'll have links to those links. You won't have to try to take it off of the video there. You'll actually get the slides.
Exactly. And just a plug for the YouTube channel as well. If you're ever watching this in the future, feel free to reach out, send us an email. We can get you the slides as well. So thank you again, everyone. Have a great afternoon.